Rod, it's a bit early in the morning still, but thank you very much. It's great to see you. It's always very encouraging to see you in your artist's attic.
Yeah, am I airy here? It's cold and rainy outside here in Budapest. It feels very Central Europe. Time to put on some cello music and brew a pot of tea and get busy writing.
Well, on the northeastern edges of the Roman Empire, where I live in the Welsh hills, it's even colder and rainier. And I just hope someone doesn't start up with some bagpipes or something. Um, Rod, it's great to see you. I wanted to talk to you about anti-Semitism. You and I have talked about it in the past, and it's almost like one of those. It's like a kind of coming out. You need to know where the person you're talking to is sometimes in order to get a fair hearing, because some of the language that we use gets misunderstood or misheard or translated or lost in translation. And I know that you share with me some of the concern that somehow anti-Semitism, which reared its head in such an appalling way in the first part of the 20th century and created Auschwitz, which I hope we'll talk about in a second, is back, really back, big time. And
Mhm.
it's really quite hard to explain why, because it's not really to do in our. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it isn't about defending or not defending the state of Israel. It isn't about replacement theology in Catholic thought. It's something about it's something more than that, and we're going to have a very difficult conversation which verges between the political, the intellectual, and the metaphysical. That's quite hard to pull off nowadays.
It really is because what I find in trying to talk about this is people say, "Well, what you really mean is you're defending the state of Israel and the Gaza so-called genocide," or what you really mean is, "No, no, no, I'm talking about anti-Semitism, about hating the Jews as Jews." And honestly, Gavin, I never imagined we would be having a conversation like this in my lifetime. I thought that was all over and done with. In fact, when I 5 years ago, when I published my book, Live Not by Lies, I talked about the rise of what I call soft-totalitarianism. And it was all about the left. And I quoted at length Hannah Arendt from her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, the signs that she saw that a society is on the verge of accepting totalitarianism. And this is based on her study of Nazi Germany and Bolshevik Russia. And I talked about the main sign, she said, which was mass loneliness and atomization, but there were others. For example, people who no longer cared about truth, but rather cared about fulfilling their psychological needs. They would believe preposterous things instead of the truth, and also the willingness to transgress for the pleasure of transgression.
Hmm.
There were some other things too, but one of the things Arendt said in her book was anti-Semitism is a precursor. I didn't even include it in my book because even though I was talking about only the left then, because the left was where the problem was, even the left had anti-Semitism under control, or so I thought. I thought they had confined it to the fringes of lunatics within the academy. Lo, in the last 5 years, it came raging out, bubbling out of the academy, and now it's everywhere on the left, and it's come up on the right as well. So it's disorienting to say the least, but here we are. We've got to deal with it.
It came to me through some Catholic clergy who I discovered were Holocaust deniers. I know what Holocaust denial is. In English circles, it was always Irving. I mean, Irving had this and people looked at him and thought, "You're mad, and you're probably bad."
Mm-hmm.
Because the evidence is so completely against you. I mean, if ever there has been a historical event where the eyes of the world have examined it in minutiae, it's Auschwitz and the final solution, whatever you call the final solution.
Mm-hmm.
I was just astonished to discover that Catholics could find themselves attracted to that. And one of the things I'm dealing with now, and I'm you, it's not. I'm not sure it's the same as your experience of paedophilia, but I would say that in terms of shock, moral shock for me, to platform a priest who supported or was a paedophile is only just worse in my mind to
Mm-hmm.
platforming a priest who is or was a Holocaust denier. That there's a level of raw evil that it somehow attaches to the project that I can't disassociate from the person. And so when I've discovered that we have priests who are full-time Holocaust deniers, and then a whole load of stuff that comes from that. I know we're in some very strange territory.
We are. I mean, it has been said that Adolf Hitler has replaced Satan as the greatest embodiment of evil in our time. And I think that's true in terms of describing the culture, this post Christian culture we're in. But it really is impossible, with the possible exception of Mao and Stalin, to come up with a greater embodiment of evil than Hitler. But that's not contested. But and what makes Hitler so particularly evil is that he engineered the systematic extermination of 6 million people, most of them Jews. And this is the sort of thing that was settled history, but now suddenly it's not. And for the life of me, I can't understand where it's coming from. Hannah Arendt said that the reason anti-Semitism is a precursor to totalitarianism is because it trains people to think in terms of scapegoats.
Yeah.
And to come up with a simple solution for all their problems, to offload them onto a particular people, usually the Jews. Um, and this is one of the reasons I was so alarmed about the way the left embraced identity politics starting about 20 years ago. It really became mainstream because they said that all of the problems in the world is a fault of white people, especially white males, and especially white male heterosexual Christians. I mean, that's lunacy, but they got used to thinking that way. So it was an easy side move for them to bring in Jews as white coated and to fit it into their malignant system. But I thought we on the right, especially we Christians, were not susceptible to that. And so that's why I find myself, like you, just gobsmacked by how not only that this exists among us Christians, but that it has come at us so fast and blown up like a brush fire.
Let's talk a moment about white toxicity, because I think the process you've described is exactly the process that this what feels like a three-card trick is being played on us. So the purpose is to disguise the fact that human beings are caught in a metaphysical struggle. We're not Zoroastrians, and people will accuse me of being dualists, but let me do it for a moment, between good and evil, but between Jesus and Satan is not the equivalent of Jesus. He's a fallen angel, but nonetheless, Jesus is the epitome of all goodness within the Holy Trinity, and Satan is the epitome of all rebellion and perversion. And so the struggle we find ourselves in is between those two things. And it seems to me that the process you've described by a series of projections is to get other people, other scapegoats, other gods even, to stand in for this great essential metaphysical struggle that we've been given our lives partly to understand and engage in the overcoming of. And so the first way in which you can wreck the project of our putting right eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of the good and of evil is to persuade us that good and evil are different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so evil has become, if you can make white men evil, well, you can. It's not hard to make Jews evil. You could make Muslims evil. You could make black people in South Africa evil. There are all kinds of variants on this projection theory. But it seems to me that the most pernicious, the one that's been around for longest, is to make the Jews evil. And that's why we've moved, as you quite rightly say, so quickly from practicing it on white elderly Christian men to Jews. I should be
Right.
grateful, but I'm not.
Right. Right. Well, I remember when I would read historical accounts of the way our Christian ancestors treated the Jews. I mean, it was horrifying to me. I'm not talking about the Holocaust necessarily, but all throughout Christian history, I mean, the Jews have constantly been scapegoated. But I thought,
Right.
oh, we're beyond that, thank God. But no, we're not. And one thing that I've noticed in some of my recent reading, because since all this came up, I find myself just burying myself in histories of the Weimar Republic, because I think we're definitely having a Weimar moment.
Absolutely, completely.
Yeah,
Yeah, so many parallels.
yeah, and this Jew hatred is just part of a constellation of factors we can get into. But The Jews are often blamed by Christians for being money lenders, and they're very good at money, and they control Hollywood and things like that. Well, it turns out the reason they had to get involved in money lending was because Christians in centuries past couldn't do it because of the church's laws against usury. Uh, One reason Jews got into show business in the early part of the 20th century is because that world was considered too vulgar for Christians, to respectable Christians, to get involved in. So basically, we forced them, this minority, to have to learn certain skills to survive, and now we're blaming them for having gotten good at it. I mean, it's really extraordinary.
Well, and that was the history of the Middle Ages, exactly the same. The usury was not allowed, the church was not allowed to use usury. So even though let's make the Jews do it, and then when the Jews do it, and we get let's kill the Jews or expel the Jews. But the thing that always surprised me and set off the alarm bells was that even if this was a minority on whom we projected all our angst and our rage and our concern, even so, the level of vitriolic, murderous hatred was disproportionate with their social crime, however bad their social crime was.
Mhm.
And so the pogroms in the Soviet Union, the well, call them pogroms because it's a good word, in medieval Catholic Europe, had exactly the same kind of quality. It went beyond the military, the political, the sociological, and the projective. It seemed to have an element of raw evil to it, and that's one of the reasons why I was so intense about my concern of Holocaust denial. We're not talking, I think, only in terms of Hannah Arendt. We're not talking only in terms of projective mechanisms and scapegoating. We're really involved in a struggle between good and evil, and I can't think of any other reason why it should suddenly erupt as it has done. Again,
Mhm.
I just don't think the sociological reasons are strong enough.
Right, and it's demonic straight up. I
Right.
mean, and I think that this is the devil, the enemy, always wants to strike at God any way he can, and uh, and the Jews are the chosen people. We know that through the Bible. The Almighty God has a special relationship with them, and there is no better way to anger God than, well, to persecute the church, but also persecute the Jews, I think. And I mean, I've been to Auschwitz, and let me tell you, I wish someone would frog march Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes through Auschwitz so they can see where this malignant, these tropes and this rhetoric they're dealing with, where it ultimately leads. This is not something to be joked about. But tell me about you. You were in Auschwitz too earlier in your life, right?
Auschwitz has been terribly important to me because it was the point where I began my journey from lazy agnosticism into a passionate love affair with God, who has emerged from it. And in a sense, I see this theologically as God saying, "Look, however bad things are, I will use them to bring you to me." But they do get very bad. When I saw as a teenager what had happened at Auschwitz, because teenagers are not stupid. They do a lot of thinking. There's a great deal of sort of philosophical anthropology going inside most teenage heads most of the time. I remember thinking, all the things I know about human beings, I can't fit this in. I
Mhm.
cannot see how even the meanest and nastiest human beings I've ever read about or encountered could do this to other human beings. There's got to be factor X here. What is factor X that has produced these little children's spectacles, these little children's shoes, this utter remorseless dehumanization of people who are only too human and so like me? And I thought, well, I'm seeing evil. This is evil. And then with a great shock, I remember thinking, well, if the world I've been placed in has got this kind of evil in it, I better find out where the antidote is, because otherwise, this is hell.
Mhm.
We're already in hell. And so that began a long, and I'm sorry to say, much too slow process of me uh, going on a rather lazy and self satisfying philosophical journey to find God, whom I eventually found in Christ. And then when one of the first things that happened, I suppose, was then discovering real spiritual struggle. I mean, you mentioned the demonic, and some people are going to be a bit itchy and scary about that. But the moment you embark upon a relationship with Jesus, you find evil very close at hand. And it's taken me, as a not very clever man stuck in my head too much, it's taken me so much of my life to recognize that stuff happens outside my head that is not susceptible to rational argument,
Right.
but that it's metaphysical. And of course, Freud made it so difficult for us to do that because he linked it forever with the idea of mental illness and a whole series of other, mainly intellectuals from the left, tried to demythologize evil and find some kind of other, make it some kind of pathogen or other. But the
Mhm.
fact is, and as Christians, that's what we know we're dealing with. And every so often, when something of an extreme nature comes out, you can't find the right words or the right mechanisms to describe. You say, well, actually, this is probably evil. And I think, in terms of the eruption of the Jew hatred that we are finding ourselves immersed in, that's what it is. And as you quite rightly say, politically, it's the canary in the coal mine because every time this has happened in some really serious way, every time this thing has grabbed people in a way that they haven't paid attention to, it's usually a precursor of something really terrible.
Right, right. Last year I read an academic history of the Nazis' involvement with the occult and the esoteric. I'd always heard that there was some of that. Himmler was especially into these rituals, these dark rituals. He would take the SS leadership to Wewelsburg Castle, and they wanted to turn that into sort of a dark cathedral of Nazi religion. But it was actually much, much deeper than I thought. Hitler wasn't particularly interested in that, but he was certainly the target of it and was affected by it, I think. But the whole in pre-Nazi Germany, I found the esoteric, the occult. It was all the rage in the smart circles. And this was pre World War One, but after World War One, it got even worse because people were desperate for some sort of answer for what had happened to
Mm-hmm.
them, what had happened to Germany, and they got into all sorts of dark things. And the Nazis, in particular, with their divinization of the Aryan race. They practiced rituals and they opened themselves to it. And you're a priest, I'm a layman, but we both have had in our own lives direct experience of evil, and we've certainly known demonic evil, and we're both friends with exorcists, so we know this is not a joke. However much people might laugh about it, it's not a joke. Funnily enough, Gavin, Tucker Carlson, who has brought this whole business straight into the American political mainstream by platforming this horrible creature, Nick Fuentes, this Holocaust denier, anti Semite, racist, every bad thing he is, and he revels in it. Tucker was attacked, or claims to have been attacked in his bed by a demon that scratched him and left him bloody. Now, people are laughing about that a lot. They're saying, oh, Tucker's
Mm.
lost his mind. I'll tell you though that I used to be friends with Tucker, and right after this happened to him, he told me about it over text, and it really shook him up. And he describes himself as a bad Episcopalian, doesn't go to church, but it made him start reading his Bible. And I even connected him to a friend of mine who was an exorcist, a priest. Tucker decided in the end not to let the priest come over and pray for him because he said that Tucker, is just too Protestant for this, which I found kind of strange that he believes he was attacked by an evil spirit, that physically attacked by an evil spirit, and yet bringing over an Orthodox exorcist is just too weird. Well, I don't know. Let's assume that it really did happen, that Tucker really was attacked. All I can tell you is I did the timeline on this, and Tucker started getting very, very dark in his broadcasts, bringing on people like that fellow, the amateur historian who said Churchill is the real villain in World War II, and
Mm-hmm.
dark people like that. Tucker started having them on shortly after this attack. I can't say, aha, there you have it. But I think that if Tucker was telling the truth, that he was attacked by a demon, then I think that could explain a lot of what we're seeing today.
Yes, just for the record, I'm a Catholic layman now, though I was an Anglican clergyman. But you're absolutely right. We both had a good deal of experience in the area of deliverance, and I have to say that it's perfectly although, as you say, people will laugh at Tucker for what he said, it's entirely consistent with phenomena that have happened of that kind. But as is, curiously enough, his reaction against an orthodox prayers. So, what, as you say, it's a bit odd. If one puts this into the realm of spiritual warfare, which I'd like to do for a moment, at the risk of losing some of our audience, but on the other hand, also at the risk of helping some of the rest of them, there is a very strange reaction against both the deeper kind of Catholic theology and the deeper kind of Orthodox theology, precisely where it intersects with evil. And as you say, if this was a medical matter, and you'd had some kind of eruption in the bowels of some pain, and somebody said, "Look, I have a specialist, actually, a mainstream specialist who can come and help you," who would say, "No, I'm not going to do it." But there's this reaction against those who are expert in the spiritual warfare, which is a symptom of the demonic thing itself. Which is why Protestants find the idea of Mary, who has such a powerful capacity in the whole area of spiritual war. That's why they react so badly against her. So I think that I'm taking too many words to say yes, I agree with you. I think your succinct analysis that something's got into Tucker as well as got at him is a perfectly cogent explanation, and it ought to be thought about. Evil's got into this situation, and in some strange way, Tucker has enabled it. I mean, can you talk about Nick Fuentes? I've been talking to a few people and saying, as I've been trying to explain what's been going on, that this guy that I'd never heard of beyond 3 months ago has suddenly emerged and been given a mainstream platform. J.D. Vance is talking about him. Tucker Carlson is. He's suddenly everywhere, and you could hardly find a less appealing public voice.
Right.
Who is Fuentes, and why on earth would Tucker Carlson has said, I can have someone and I don't have to push back. It doesn't mean endorsement, and all these things which are technically true, but they miss the point.
Yeah,
The point
they do.
is that he's given this man Fuentes a platform, and now everyone's heard about it. Can I just say one thing before I forget it? Because I think it's really important. In terms of the explosion of evil and the Nazis being interested in it, and I was just amazed the other day to discover that the fastest growing part of TikTok is witch talk.
Yeah.
So for witch talk to become a thing suggests that at the very lowest level of sociological phenomena, this evil stuff has got hold of people in a very big way, in a populist way too. So who is Nick Fuentes?
Well, Nick Fuentes is a 27-year-old white American, Mexican American, actually, which is kind of an interesting thing given how much he hates non-white people. He's a streamer, what they call a live streamer, and he has this organization called America First, and he proclaims himself to be a traditional Catholic, even. The things he says just are in such violation of Catholic teaching. Anyway, that's how he presents himself. He is openly Nazi. He says things like Hitler is effing.
You really mean that? You
No,
really
no,
mean, because the word Nazi has been so abused in almost every context. What does he mean by the word?
Well, you can, and people shouldn't take my word for it. You can find him all over the internet. He says things like Hitler is effing cool, and just praises Hitler all the time. He said in one of his most notorious live streams, he said, when we take power, a lot of these people, including the Jews, will have the death penalty. He says it. And it's not just about the Jews. He's obsessed with the Jews and what he calls world Jewry, organized Jewry, which is straight out of Nazi rhetoric. But he also hates all non-white people. He says that many women want to get raped. They want to have a man beat the S out of them. This is it. You might think I'm saying this just to slur the man, but the man has said it himself, and these videos are easily available on the internet. So, but what he has done, Fuentes, is develop this a significant audience among extremely angry young white men.
Right,
And they are. And we should talk about that because they have reason to be angry, but he is exploiting that. He's giving voice to their rage. And but he was still pretty much a fringe figure. I mean, he would attack people like Tucker Carlson. He would attack J.D. Vance. He called J.D. Vance a race mixer for being married to a woman of Indian extraction, whom he called a jeet, a racial slur. And he would also go after Charlie Kirk, the stoutly evangelical Christian who was the leader of conservative youth and was actually doing very good work to try to save people from this. But anyway, Fuentes reached the mainstream when Tucker Carlson, on October 27th of this year, brought him on to his very popular interview show. Most people will have never heard of Nick Fuentes. Most people over the age of 30 will have never heard of him. But Tucker Carlson is the most popular conservative media figure in America. Tucker had him on his show, which, all right, that's problematic right there. I don't think you should be elevating this particular guy. By all means, let's talk about the problems that young men have that are driving them to radicalization, but don't put the guy on. But if you're going to put him on, then subject him to a critical interview. Tucker's quite capable of doing that. He had the American Senator Ted Cruz, whom he despises. He had Ted Cruz on and really just went at him. But Tucker had Fuentes on, and it was a very soft interview. There were some mildly critical questions, but watching that thing, I thought that if the first time you had ever heard a thing about Nick Fuentes was that Tucker interview, you would think, well, that's an edgy young guy. He seems to have a chip on his shoulder about the Jews, but he's basically normal. That is not at all who Nick Fuentes really is. Nick Fuentes is on his best behavior on Tucker's show. And so now I'm hearing from friends back in the U.S. who say that they're listening to older people, like a 53-year-old repairman who came to my friend's house who said, that Nick Fuentes makes some sense. That man could only have gotten this from Tucker Carlson because older people don't know how to find Fuentes online anywhere. So this is what we're dealing with here. And it has caused this huge eruption on the right in America because as soon as Tucker did this, there was a huge outcry. And a man named Kevin Roberts, who is 51 years old, the head of the Heritage Foundation, probably the most important right-wing think tank in Washington, for some reason, he felt obliged to make a short video message defending Tucker Carlson against his critics for having Nick Fuentes on. And that just made his problems even worse. They've had so many people, especially Jews, resigning from the Heritage Foundation. Kevin Roberts has said in a couple of follow-up videos, I was wrong, I made a mistake there, but it's just not going away. Because two things, the liberal media are now using this horrific, completely unnecessary event to say, aha, see, we knew it all along. You were all a bunch of Nazis, you right-wingers.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and it's also the case that the old guard of the Republican Party, the ones that Trump defeated, who really represent a dead Reaganite consensus that's not coming back, they're suddenly reasserting themselves and saying, see what has been allowed to happen? These lunatics have taken over our institutions, and now they're bringing white supremacy and Nazism into them. It's a complete disaster, and it's not going away because Fuentes has, since his boost on Tucker, he's been making very boastful videos saying to J.D. Vance, saying, if you criticize me, I'm coming after you. I'm going to get my army of groypers, his cult following. They call themselves groypers. The groypers will go out to Iowa, which is the first primary state in 2028. They'll go to Iowa and they'll campaign against you. Now, if I'm J.D. Vance, and I'm not going to be all that worried about these neo-Nazi incels knocking on the door of Iowa farmhouses telling people not to vote for me. But it is an issue, and it's not going to go away until Vance addresses it.
But it's much more than a political issue because, as you say, politically, this is small fry. My greatest fear, I'm not sure my greatest fear, a fear that I felt was that in the vacuum of the right has been pummeled so badly by the woke left as it's taken its march through the institutions. And I don't need to rehearse that here, but I thought the one thing that must not happen is some malevolent right-wing figure drawing together all the anger, the rage, the dispossession, the utter desperation, and making a political movement out of it, a kind of new Hitler.
Mhm.
And the reason that I thought the reason that in the last couple of years I've been so enthused by J.D. Vance has been because I thought that he was the virtuous antidote to these things.
Mm.
He seems to me to have exactly the right capacity. And there was the possibility that under J.D. Vance, America would find a way of rebalancing this dreadful psychological, spiritual, and political imbalance that we found ourselves in since the Second World War. And the one threat would be if a sort of demonic perversion of Vance arose.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that that's exactly what you've described in
Yeah.
Fuentes.
Yeah.
Fuentes appears to me to be a demonic perversion of a kind of solution that Vance might be able to give us in terms of a recalibration of the very, very difficult things we're dealing with. But if a Nazi demagogue should arrive on the right, then not only does that split the right, but it feeds straight into what we've been talking about, and eventually we all get taken over by the demonic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No, that's true. It's true. I mean, it's worth going back to talk about how totalitarianism of the left and the right came into being. And I'm using Hannah Arendt's analysis because even as this is happening on the right, and you and I are talking about this Fuentes because he's such an egregious figure, and this is, suddenly it's taken over, or I should say, the conversation has engulfed senior figures on the right. Similar things have been happening on the left for a while, and we shouldn't overlook the fact that in New York City recently, around the same time, voters elected Zoran Mandani, a young, super charismatic Muslim. I don't think he's a practicing Muslim, but he does pal around with some very sinister figures. They've elected him, and he's a Marxist. Elected him as their mayor, and he has trafficked himself in the past in anti-Semitic rhetoric. So this is we're looking at some pretty dark Weimar-like things. Anyway, Hannah, we should try to understand why young people are drawn to these extreme figures. And in the case of Fuentes, um, he appeals to young men who have been raised in a culture, as we said earlier, in which they've been demonized. They've been told that you are what's wrong with the world. And they have also been raised in a culture where they will not have the sort of prospects for economic prosperity that our generation had, that their parents' generation had. The economy is against them. Many of them were told by authorities in their schools, you should take on a lot of student debt and you'll pay it off with a good job. Well, now they find themselves immersed in debt and unable to find work, and so on and so forth. Plus the polarization between the sexes, between men and women, has gotten just to some insane degree where they aren't meeting each other. Men and women. I would love to say that the poll results showing that young men and young women are not having much sex now. I would love it to be because they were virtuous, but it's not it. It's that they can't talk to each other. And so into all of this, into the social fragmentation and the atomization that comes about by the internet, you have an entire generation of young men, young white men in particular, who feel despised. They're angry. The systems have failed them. They've ceased to believe in traditional authorities. And it's been waiting for someone like Nick Fuentes to show himself. I don't think he's going to be a new Hitler. He's too trivial a figure for that. But the fact that Nick Fuentes has found traction tells us that there are a lot of people who would be ready for a Hitler. Last point, this past summer, I was at a big event, a concert, and I overheard, it was in Hungary, but I overheard a young man with a British accent say, everything that's wrong with my country, the only thing that's going to fix it is fascism. And
Yeah.
I wrote to a friend, I texted a friend back in London who's a conservative journalist. I said, how widespread is this? He said, Nigel Farage hears it on the campaign trail every day. My friend said, honestly, I think Nigel is the only thing standing between us and fascism. So it's not just an American problem.
No, gosh, there's so much to respond to, and also the trouble is the thinking is so fresh. Although, we're talking about it now, it's been very difficult to digest everything that's been taking place. But I agree the analysis that people are looking for some very powerful, almost revenge figure from the right in order
Mhm.
to deal with decades of punishment from the left as they experience it. And the trouble is, I mean, well, let me not go into British politics, but you're right. What we're dealing with is forms of polarized antagonisms between people that have become so stretched that the danger of them spilling over into hate-filled violence becomes more real the more stretched they get. And as you say, it's happening between Jews and the non-Jews. It's happening between men and women. It's happening between the right and the left. And such damage is being inflicted on human beings by their polarized opposites that the longing for revenge and the assumption that only violence can properly give effect to the rage and the fear, it means that there is there are so many levels at which our civilization can be drawn into mutual destruction, and
Mhm.
and and, and worst of all, of course, pseudo virtuous destruction. It is a good thing that I'm going to destroy you because you are a bad thing,
Mhm.
and this projected bad thing, which we're talking about, we've located in anti-Semitism. But you quite rightly say, if it is a spiritual phenomenon or a metaphysical one, we're going to see it in all kind of other different theaters of war, so to speak. And these theaters of war include male and female, they include rich and poor, they include left and right. And the problem is, I see the Fuentes phenomenon as a spark. The kerosene has been poured all over the dry material, and what we don't need is a spark. And Fuentes, to me, represents that spark.
Yeah, I've been following all year the interviews that David Betts has been giving. Betts, for those who don't know, he's a professor in the War Studies
Yeah.
Department of King's College London, and he's an academic expert on civil wars, how civil wars start. And he's been warning that all across Western Europe and in the United States, all across the Western world, the conditions are ripe for this. And by civil war, he doesn't mean two armies facing off. He means something more like the troubles that we had in Northern Ireland or
Right.
Beirut, something like that, where you have religious groups like Muslim versus Christian or Muslim versus everybody else. You have different races. You have left and right. Squaring off with bombings, assassinations, rioting, looting, things like that. He said we're very close to it, and we don't. And the people who are in charge of our societies don't seem to understand that. This past summer, I was at a conference in Dubrovnik, and I met there a man named Thibaut de Montbrial. Thibaut is a French lawyer. He's had to live under police guard, constant police guard for the last 9 years because his job is to advise the French security services, the different agencies, on give them legal advice for how to handle jihadis. And he told me when we met that civil war is coming, and even at the senior most levels of the security services, they understand this, and so it's just waiting for a spark. And I had been thinking that, well, it could happen in Europe. I live in Europe. I can see it's not here in Hungary, but I can see what's happening in the UK. I can see what's happening in France. This can't go on. But now, having just gotten back from the US and talked to people in the so-called Zoomer generation, those in their 20s who are listening to Fuentes, I can see it happening in my own country. And the boomers and the Xers don't seem to know we're not even aware of what's happening at this level because we're in such information silos. And I think some of the
Yeah.
worst offenders here are the clergy.
Yeah.
I I find that I'm hearing from I'm Eastern Orthodox. I hear from my Orthodox friends back home that they're seeing a lot of young men, angry young men, turn up at church, which is a great thing. But a lot of these young men are coming in with all sorts of racial hatred on their minds that they've gotten from the internet and anti Semitism. And the clergy have to try to deprogram them. But, to say a word in defense of the clergy, they weren't trained for this world. They have no idea how to deal with it. And so a lot of them are preferring not to deal with it. I have evangelical friends who are I'm thinking of one in particular, a Southern Baptist ordained pastor, though he doesn't have a parish. He teaches at a prestigious evangelical university. And he said, Rod, I'm getting, my classes are full of these young white men, middle class white men who despise the Jews. He said, and my friend is 50 years old. He said, I was raised in an evangelical culture that, if anything, was philo-Semitic. And now suddenly I'm confronted with the people, my son's generation, who are anti-Semitic. And you ask them, where are you getting this? It's all
Yeah.
coming from the internet. It's coming from Fuentes and others.
So I think your idea of information silos is very important indeed, because again, one of the things you discover, and you meet, I sing a certain amount, so occasionally I talk to other people in the choir, and then you say, do you know, have you heard, have you seen? And sometimes, have you seen the famous Rod Dreher? Oh yes, I watch him too. Hooray, fantastic! Have you heard of Nick Fuentes? Nick who? The problem with the information silos is that they're sort of this disinformation and disorientation lives in pockets. I mean, I did expect. I mean, certainly before Trump won his second election, I thought that civil war might come to the red and blue states in America, as the kind of the assault of the left pressed harder on the red states, and they resisted it. I could see that happening. And in a sense, that would be a kind of contained civil war. But what you've been describing now is so much worse because it's operating, I mean, almost at every single level you can think of,
Right.
Almost at every level. Not just in red and blue states in America, but in every country. Human beings have been polarized in almost every social respect, with a kind of rage, a vengeance, a fear, and an utterly incoherent emotional angst or anger that is
Mhm.
almost incapable of being talked to. I mean, how does your friend talk to a generation of young men who suddenly become anti-Semitic? They don't know why they're anti-Semitic. I mean, you
Mhm.
can begin to pick away at a few things and say, well, is it Hamas propaganda? Is it to do with Zionism? Is it to do with reading Shakespeare? Where did you get this from?
Yeah.
My experience is they've no idea. It's like it's in the water or in the air.
Yeah, and I think that these young people do feel an immense amount of anxiety over the chaos in our world today. And on the positive side, I was at the pilgrimage from Paris to Chartres this year. I wrote a story about it for the Free Press. 20,000 young Catholics, mostly French, but also some from the UK and other European countries, who were all joyfully walking for 3 days, praying, singing hymns on Pentecost weekend to Chartres. And the lesson I got from them, just interviewing people in the crowd, was the basic lesson is: look, we've been given nothing by our parents. We were raised in a culture where all the guardrails are down. There's no direction, no meaning, no purpose. We're seeking God. We're seeking meaning. We're seeking purpose and transcendence and roots. And thank God they're doing it by taking up this ancient pilgrim route, and they're seeking it in a healthy way, often against the wishes of their elders. Because I remember when I was there was some question about whether the local bishop would even allow it to happen, because these older bishops are terrified of the Latin Mass people. In any case, these young people quite clearly recognize the problem into which they've been thrown, this chaotic society, and they're trying to find a good and healthy and indeed holy solution for it. In the US, Charlie Kirk, this evangelical who was married to a Catholic, he was trying his very best to confront evil, the evil of the left, and talk to people. Before he died, he was interviewed by someone who said, why are you, as a conservative and a Christian, going onto college campuses and engaging with people who hate you? And he said, because if we don't do that, if we don't talk, that's when the violence starts. Then he was killed by a confessed 22-year-old young man who had become radicalized to the left, in part by his a romantic relationship with a transgender. Well, lo, Gavin, I don't know if you've heard this, but now the conspiracy theory going around on the right, pushed by people like Candace Owens, who is also like probably second only to Fuentes in terms of her reach. She's blaming it on the Mossad and
Yeah.
the insiders around Charlie Kirk, including his wife, that they conspired to get Charlie, not the trans obsessed leftist who has confessed to it, but no, that there's got to be a deeper story there.
He changed his views on Israel.
Yeah. And but this just speaks to what Hannah Arendt said, that when you have a society in which people will believe the craziest things because it satisfies them psychologically, you're in real danger.
Okay, and I'm really reluctant to say what I'm about to say because I was so grateful for what I saw at the pilgrimage to Chartres was absolutely wonderful, and the people and the priests and the whole enterprise are unbelievably hopeful, and yet at the same time it's there as well.
Really.
To my immense surprise, I mean, so I'm a newbie. I don't mind being a newbie at my age. It's quite fun. All kinds. I get to start at the bottom of every pile, and there's something beatitudinal about that. I'm very happy to embrace being the least well informed, the least well experienced. It's fine. But I was very shocked when I discovered that the historic anti-Semitism that I knew only too well about from being moderately well read in European history is alive and well in conservative Catholicism. And the further more conservative you get, the more alive it seems to be. And this has caused me terrible misery because this is this is exactly the place I was looking at for the resources that you so movingly described about
Mhm.
a quest for holiness and transformation and and metaphysical and sacramental potency. So, in one sense, this doesn't surprise me because good and evil always lie closest together at their extremes. But it means, I think, that the solution, and I'm about to say to you what is the solution, and I'm putting it off because I have absolutely no idea. But the solution that it can be found in that area, or that area is free from perversional isn't the case. God
Yeah.
knows if only it was. Rod, where do we go for? I mean, what? So people are listening to us. Some people are ahead of us and say, "Well, we've seen this. Dreher and Ashenden are catching up only too slowly." Other people will be very surprised at some of the things we've said and
Mhm.
think we may have a screw loose or two, but we don't. Um, where now?
Well, I think the best thing that we can do is put at the front of our minds what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said was one of the greatest lessons he learned from the Gulag, being imprisoned in the Gulag. He said he learned that the line between good and
Yeah,
evil does not
goes right
pass
through there.
between social classes or races or anything. It passes down the middle of every human heart. We start there. We realize that all of us are sinners. This is the lesson of the gospel. We all need Jesus. And as soon as we start drawing these distinctions of good and evil by pushing evil out of our own heart and onto the scapegoat, whether it's Jews or blacks or men, whatever, we're heading down a very, very dark path. And I think it's important that we start, all of us, start informing ourselves about the history of anti-Semitism and how it got a hold among Christians. I mean, look, we can go back into Scripture, and there was intense conflict, understandably, between the early Christians and the Jews, because the Jewish authorities were trying to stamp them out. But this is 2,000 years ago, right? And it's not like it happened the day before yesterday. I was talking to this Orthodox Christian friend who said, "Well, do you know there were so many Jews among the Bolsheviks, among the communists?" And I said, "Yes, that's true. They were there, but you have to think
Mm.
about this. Why were they there? They were there because the Tsarist regime, with the blessing of the Orthodox Church, carried out pogroms constantly." And the Jews, these young Jews who were drawn to Marxism, they put aside their ancestral religion and they took up Marxism both as a secular, atheistic, secular substitute for the religion in which they could no longer believe, but they also believed that communism would free them from the pogroms. They were quite wrong, of course, but you can understand how it happened. And as I told my friend too, uh, in 2019, I was in Moscow doing research for Live Not by Lies. I was having dinner at the home of a Russian Orthodox family. And I'd been hearing these horrific tales the previous 3 days of people who had survived the communist prisons and had been horribly persecuted. And I made the remark, very naive now, I realize. I said, I don't understand how any Russian could have believed anything the Bolsheviks said. The father sitting at the table, mind you, these are all Christians, these aren't Jews. He said, you don't know? Well, let me tell you. And then he gave me a capsule 400-year history of how the poor had been ground down by the aristocracy, by the czar, and the church. And he said, I'm not saying that what the Bolsheviks did was justified. Clearly, it was not. But you have to understand they came from somewhere.
That's right. That's where they came from.
And I think that we need to keep that in mind, and we need to think also beyond simply reacting to the horror of the Nick Fuenteses or these Catholic priests you're talking about who are engaged in Holocaust denial. We absolutely mustn't keep our mouths shut. We have to stand up to that. But at the same time, we need to think about root causes, about what drives people in this day and age to embrace that sort of lunacy. There in the UK, I mean, your society seems to be falling apart under the pressure of mass migration and many, many things. And people will look for some solution. The simpler the solution that can engage their passions, their temptation to hatred, will capture a lot of people.
Well, you're right. Again, the danger is of appearing to be naive. I just want to say that once again, in the terms of the story of the Russian father sitting at the table, the polarization became all the more intense because it stretched so far back into history. And there is one piece of good news, and it's the kind of it's the Voldemort factor. In England, you're not allowed to mention Tommy Robinson because the state has been so successful at toxifying and telling lies about him. And he also it looked like he might have been a Nick Fuentes character. He's very fluid, very articulate, and but the other day, in the most extraordinary way, he was talking about the fact that as he grew up and until recently, he knew a great deal about Muhammad and Islam. He had Muslim friends who were engaging in debate, but he knew almost nothing about Jesus. It looks like he's becoming a Christian. He's certainly surrounded by Christians, and he's beginning to talk about Jesus. Now, if somebody who's capable of being the inflammatory ignition to the kerosene-soaked pile, like Tommy Robinson, gets Jesus, there's just a chance that the power, the beauty, the love, the transformation, the antidote to all the things we've been talking about can begin to dilute some of the toxicity we've been describing. So I don't know where, in terms of the pockets of society, the hope lives. But when I hear somebody who could have been an agent for what we've been talking about taking off, have his face change, move from rigid hatred to looks of compassion, because he's encountered Jesus, then there are moments of hope. I'm at the risk of being naive. Jesus appears to me to be the only hope we've got.
Oh, yeah. And look, Gav, if you look back at the American Civil Rights Movement, it was no coincidence that it was led by Black pastors. And Martin Luther King Jr. said a lot about how the risk of meeting the hatred that was poured out and the violence on those Black folks, the danger of meeting it with hatred. He said it will destroy us if we do. And he and his colleagues, flawed as they were, they overcame that through love, right? But it must also be said, they were speaking in the 1950s and 1960s to an American culture that was still recognizably Christian, and they could awaken in the people who heard them, the whites who heard them, a moral conscience and say, this is wrong. This is not only wrong, this is evil. And they were able to overcome. We shall overcome. I wonder though how we do this. And
I was about to say there is no awakening of the moral conscience to take place because they haven't been I mean, everyone has a moral conscience, and Paul tells us that in Romans 1. But socially and civically, we have no moral conscience.
right.
It hasn't been taught. At least there are no reservoirs of a Christian moral conscience to awaken in people under 50.
Yeah, and that's the particular challenge we have now. And you know, I famously wrote this in my most recent book, Living in Wonder. I talked about how I was approached at Oxford in 2022 by a 27-year-old
Yeah,
Anglican
yeah, yeah,
ordinand, you know, who warned me that atheism is not the biggest enemy of the church; it's the occult. Well, to go back to the occult, there's so much of this is mixed up with the hatred of the Jews. And my
yeah.
fear is that people, you know, as Chesterton famously said, you know, when they quit believing in God, they'll believe in anything. This is something we have to contend with as well. And we dare not forget the spiritual warfare aspect of this. That, yes, we have to speak out. Yes, we have to educate ourselves. Yes, we have to challenge whether it comes from the left or the right, this Jew hatred. But we also cannot neglect prayer because this is an ancient hatred. The enemy, the devil, is real, and he hates the Jewish people intensely. And we have to fight him on their behalf and on behalf of our own children who are being sucked into this. I have a good friend back in the U.S., very faithful Catholic, whose son has been caught up in this, and he said, "I don't know what to do."
Yeah,
He was not raised this way, but
yeah.
during COVID, he was locked in his room, and he went down the rabbit hole of these conspiracy theorists, and now he believes all this. I think that there's probably a parallel there, Gavin, but the way that the whole trans phenomenon took off among the very
Sure.
online.
No, no, I'm sure that's true. And again, the internet has made it almost impossible for parents to be parents because they've been, their children have been raised by, by other sources. We're back to the phenomenon of the information silo. Even parents and children don't know what each other are experiencing. I think I mean, so first of all, thank you for the conversation. It's. I mean, one of the things you do so well is to tell people what's going on. And I don't mean to flatten you, but we, people should subscribe to your writings because you're one of the very few people who can manage the intellectual and the spiritual at the same time. There are lots of people who can do the spiritual, lots of people who do the political, but holding it together in some composite way is not easy, and you're one of the few people who does it. So thank you for this conversation. Thank you for helping me to understand what's going on in America because I have my own version of an information silo.
Oh, we all do. We all do.
We
Look,
all we all do.
as you know, I asked a friend of mine who's a Washington insider, not a Zoomer. I said, "So how far has has this Nick Fuentes stuff gone among the young in Washington, working in conservative circles?" And he estimated about 30 to 40% of them were either Fuentes followers or at least Fuentes adjacent. When I was in Washington recently, I made a point of asking every Zoomer I met who works in that world, and they all said yes, it's true. Now, to be
Wow.
fair, Emily Jashinsky, who is a Washington correspondent for Unheard, the UK online magazine, she had a report out saying she went and did some reporting and said it's much fewer than that, many fewer than that, and I hope she's right, you know. But the thing is, the stuff is so underground. I was talking to a Christian friend of mine, works in Republican politics in Washington, and he said that he has been shocked by how many of his Christian friends, Protestant and Catholic, have been sucked into it, and how anti-Semitism has become a sort of a code that allows you access into circles. The man's girlfriend said that she
Really?
came to visit him and was shocked when someone stood up and said, "Who here is anti-Semitic?" This was at a drinks party, and this was a way of determining who could be trusted and who couldn't. I mean, it's just
Good
breathtaking.
grief.
I
Oh,
know, I know,
just,
and
I mean, wow. I don't know what
and
to say.
I don't know that we can reason these people out of it, Gab, because this I asked this one very well informed Zoomer. I said, "What do they want? What did the Fuentes people want? What are their demands? He said they have no demands. They just want to tear it all down. And I remember when he said that, I thought, we should all be reading Dostoevsky's novel Demons, because that's probably a better guide to what's happening now than anything you're going to read in the conservative press.
Absolutely. And wherever you chase this thing to put it right, it's like a bar of soap. You grab it and it moves. I remember listening to one of these Holocaust deniers, clergy, who's been putting, and this is another big thing. You must hate the Jews because do you know what they write in the Talmud? They write then and then the whole lot of nasty stuff about Jesus boiling in hell, and so these Jews, they hate the Messiah. They are the Antichrist, and so I thought, to tell you the truth, Ron, I've read quite a lot. I've never read the Talmud. It's just one of those things that's always been out of reach. I began to chase this up, and it turns out that it's a shadowland of ambiguity and half references. It absolutely is not what the deniers say it is. But who's read the Talmud? And who's got the time?
99% of all Jews have not read the Talmud. I'm quite sure of that.
Well, and that's the point. They've not been formed even by these ambiguous half-shadow references to someone who might or might not be Jesus, but has a few syllables and vowels of the same name. But the point is, it's the lies that go into the system. Again, someone said, well, you realize Churchill did what, was completely compromised because the Jews controlled him all the way through the war. And I said, but I've read 2 biographies. How much have you read? And then I discovered that it really is a thing. It is a thing that people say that that Churchill was controlled by Semitic because he was in debt, he was lent money. And you say, well, okay, it's a half truth. Yes, he was lent money. But if you know Churchill, if you read about Churchill, if you read the stuff, you can't possibly come to the conclusion that you've come to with this half truth. And I think one of the things I'm finding so difficult is these toxic half truths that tell lies, just out of reach of most people's access to test them. So, at least one of the things that you and I can try and do is to say, well, we know where the sources are, we'll go back to them. But then you tell people that and they say, well, that you're only saying that because you're a Zionist. And you go,
yeah. It's unfalsifiable, their claims.
Right. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with unfalsifiability, and that's becoming incredibly difficult to manage.
Well, I think we can end on this. I think that if one ever wondered how one would have behaved in the early 1930s when the Nazis were coming to power, well, guess what? Now you have a chance to find
Absolutely.
out.
Yeah.
God willing, that they will never come to power in our societies. But these decisions had to be made by Christians and others when they would hear this crazy talk in the streets or among their friends or at church or wherever back in the late 20s, early 30s in Germany. They had to make a decision about, how am I going to respond to that? Am I going to believe it? Am I going to keep my head down or just roll my eyes and just not say anything to avoid conflict? Look where that got us. We have to speak out. We have to inform ourselves, and we have to find the courage to take a stand with Christ, who told us salvation comes through the Jews.
And whatever the question, Jesus is the answer.
Absolutely.
Let's go back to Rod. Thank you for speaking out. Thank you for thinking so clearly. Thank you for putting all your energies at the disposal of goodness and truth. I'm very grateful. It's great to have you as a friend. God bless you. Keep praying for you. And I'm so grateful for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.